willkommen zu dem zweiten Vortrag heute Abend. Wir begrüßen heute Abend PBSA und Paul Steinbrück. Die beiden sind von dem Büro 51N4E aus Brüssel. Und wir haben die beiden einladen können im Rahmen eigentlich unseres Studios, was ich zusammen mit André Kempe und Oliver Thiel betreue dieses Semester im ersten Masterstudienjahr. Es sind jetzt viele Erstsemester hier, denke ich. Ich sehe auch ein paar Gesichter aus unserem Kurs, das ist ganz schön. Und wir beschäftigen uns ich sage das ganz kurz einleitend, ich hatte beim letzten Termin, als Oliver Thiel Projekte vorgestellt hat, von dem Büro von den beiden, habe ich schon was allgemein zu der Vortragsreihe gesagt. Aber wir beschäftigen uns mit einer Moschee in Duisburg, das ist das Thema unseres diessemestrigen Entwurfs, für 20.000 Gläubige. Und das sind natürlich eine Menge, 20.000. Und übergeordnet gibt es die Frage, was bedeutet es eigentlich, ein öffentliches Gebäude zu bauen, heutzutage, New Public Monuments, daher der Titel der Vortragsreihe. Ich denke, André Kempe wird vielleicht auch noch das ein oder andere Wort dazu sagen, wo es vielleicht übergeordnet um die Vortragsreihe geht. Und er wird jetzt die beiden noch vorstellen, weil die sich auch persönlich kennen. Danke.
Ja, hallo, guten Abend. I continue in English so that our guests also can understand what I'm telling you about them, especially. Christina gave already some introductive words about the theme, the topic. So all the architects we have invited in this series, we think can contribute in an adequate way on this topic. What is actually a public building nowadays? What is the public realm? Who is the public? Does it still exist? And all these kinds of questions. And we start this series now with 51N4E because we think they really can say something intelligent about that. Just quickly about the office. Was founded in '98 by Freek Persijn, Peter Swinnen, and Johan Andres. Freek is here. He just brought Paul Steinbrück with him, who is also a German, who is one of the, I think, most important collaborators of the office, and they will do it together. 51N4E is now very renowned, not only in Belgium, but all over Europe, and partly, I think, also in the whole world. They have some key projects, what they could realize. That's the Tirana Tower, which is still ongoing, but kind of quite far now already. The sea mine in Belgium, in Genk, which is quite an impressive project. Skanderbeg Square, Buddha Factory, just to name some of the most important ones. They have published books like Double or Nothing, which is a quite special architecture book, I must say. They also won the Marskant Award and made a publication on this, which is already a bit longer ago, but they operate in several countries, not only in Belgium, but also in France, Turkey, Albania, which is also an important place, and Freek was teaching in several places, in Mendrisio, at the Berlach in Rotterdam, and they lecture in quite some countries all over the world. Also one important contribution from 51N4E was the fact that Peter Swinnen, who was one of the co-founders, became the Flemish architect, something which is in Germany also hardly known, such a function, which contributed a lot to the Flemish architecture culture as a function. So Peter Swinnen also contributed, but this kind of function as such is quite interesting, I would say, to maybe learn also in Germany from countries like Holland in former times and Flanders nowadays. I pass the microphone to Freek. He will start the lecture, and after that Paul will continue. So thanks again for coming, and we are very looking forward to what you say.
Thank you very much. Maybe the last chance for people who are hidden behind corners to come and sit here. There's plenty of space, really plenty of space. So we will not hold it against you if you leave in the middle of the lecture. So if you want to come and sit here, please feel free. Okay? No reactions. Just briefly about the name of the office and the type of office we are. The name of the office, 51N4E, stands for the coordinates of Brussels, so it's 51 north, 4 east. So there you see the name of the office on the location that we are located. So our office is in Brussels, and we think we are a kind of a global office, not because we work everywhere in the world, far from that, but because we believe that the world is increasingly changing and becoming increasingly global, and that's a kind of condition that we have to work with, which is a condition of a lot of insecurity, a lot of change, and we really want to deal with that change. So we really want to use architecture to look at the transformations in society, and that's also what this lecture will be about. I don't know how we can get rid of this top thing. No. Do you know? How you can? Okay. Thank you. This is an image of Brussels and the context it is in. So this is, I think we are more or less here now in Düsseldorf. So this is the urbanized area around Brussels, one of the mega regions in the world that produce a lot of economic potential that date back for a long time, and which have urbanized steadily and very intensely the last 100 years. So this image is also to show the kind of city we think we live in, the kind of condition we have to deal with. And this condition is not only a condition of sprawl, but also a condition where today we maybe question this sprawl. But to question this sprawl, we don't have the right tools to think with. So I think if you ask the question of a new public monument, I think it's also a question of what type of environment do we live in and how do we conceptualize this environment. Just to give a reference of the thing I was showing before, so this is Brussels, Antwerp, Ghent, Flanders. This is Rotterdam. So this is an image made by Xavier de Geiter Architects, which compares these urban conditions to urban conditions like London, but also urban conditions like the Ruhrgebiet. And I think there's a lot of similarities, you could say, between the two. Similarities of a type of space, a type of organization of society, a welfare state, which is increasingly eroding and changing its face, but also its core. And we have selected today a few projects that talk about this working in this changing industrial landscape and how you could deal with that. For us, this landscape is really also a landscape which is the result of a certain mindset. This is a picture of an artist friend of mine, which is called Landscape of My Personal Belongings. And I think you could say that today's urban environment looks a bit like this. It's a collection of objects that everyone feels attached to, but as a whole, it doesn't really produce a very collective or collectively experienced space. The space is really much more of a collection of individual experience spaces. And we think it's a challenge today to rethink a certain type of collectivity, maybe less from the top, but maybe more from something that you could define as bottom, whatever that may mean. To work meaningfully in this type of space, we think it's very important not to look at objects only, because you can indeed maybe design a better sleeve for a CD, or you could design a better pen. But it's also a question of how do the two relate together, and how can you create new connections inside this kind of cumulative space. And this goes also back to the way the way people experience space. So this is a kind of Saturday market. I think this might even be a picture from the States. but where spaces like this, which are spaces which are very loosely defined, very in themselves unprecious, unspecific, but are spaces that are activated in time. And I think this time factor and this idea that space can be a tool for people to reconnect is also one of the topics of the lecture. So, new public monuments. As a title, we have a lot of questions about it. We really question the fact of the new. Given the fact that so much has been built already, is it really necessary to think about something new? Is it not more important to renew something that exists already? Yeah, public, I think that's also a big question. What could you call public today? Society has changed so much, like Andrea already mentioned. So how do we redefine this word public, and what spaces are really public today? I mean, it could happen anywhere, at any time. And then the third word, which is also quite problematic, I would say, is monument. Why a monument? What does it represent? And this idea of a space that represents and that people can identify with. It's an increasingly difficult question, but a very important one. And the idea of a space that represents something, we think in the renewal of what exists, there's a lot of potential to give the sparks for rediscovering a certain identity. Lecture will be in two parts. First part is the idea of sharing space, and the second part is maybe more some tools that we can use as architects to get to learn more about these ways of sharing and get more knowledge. So not only think from the knowledge base that we have developed when we studied, but also to learn from the experience and the intelligence of other people, which is, I think, especially if you talk about new public monuments, to understand how other people look at the things that we make. It's something very important to get to know and get to learn. So first part, sharing space. I will start with a project which is called Sea Mine. An old industrial building, part of the east of Belgium, part of an old mining factory. This space is actually the machine hall for the elevators that pulled the miners in and out the ground. So this is a space which is very precious. It was made in the time that machines were still very large. For instance, one of the rooms is a switchboard, and today you could shrink this switchboard to the size of a cell phone. So in 100 years of time, technology has changed enormously, and here it's a kind of space that celebrates the technology of the time in a space that covers it. It's a kind of shed, you could say, but a shed which is treated really like a space that represents the importance of this factory and the importance of working together. This is the building we are talking about, and these are the two mine shafts, and this is a picture after the closure of the mine, which was a huge trauma, of course, in this area. And this is the proposal that we did. The question was to make a design center, a cultural center, and a touristic center out of this building. What we did with the building was to first read it very carefully and to look at the program, but not try to fit the program into the building and to put the building back to the standard that the program was describing, but basically to look at the constraints the building has. So as I showed you before, the central part is just a shed, so it's very difficult to insulate. In the winter it's very cold. The brief was actually asking to make this into a completely climatized, completely engineered space with all the insulation you need. And we thought this was a very dumb investment. Dumb in the sense that the building is not at all made to be to house people in such a way like this space does. And secondly, if you would renew it so drastically, you would lose a lot of its qualities and a lot of its character. So we proposed a reshuffling of the program, in which we took the existing building and freed it from as much program as possible. So we installed spaces which could handle a certain flexibility, like the bar. But for instance, the foyer, we scaled it up completely. We took all of the space, but we proposed not to heat it, but just to leave it as such and to make a space which is over-dimensioned. And all of the new functions which were put into two new buildings, the exhibition space, the theater, the small theater, the offices, the meeting rooms. And these are very compact, very efficient buildings which are attached to the old and which somehow work in a kind of contrast with the existing, very functional and very upstandard, and then very loose and very overscaled. And the same logic was also continued on the top floor, where this space that you just saw, this big machine room, is basically left as it was. And the red and white tiles that you saw were continued on the bottom of the base, making a kind of incongruous landscape, for which there was no program, but we knew that we had the money for it because we reshuffled the budget, and so we could offer much more space for the same type of budget. So this is in short the intervention, the existing, extending the base, and with the two halls sticking out of that base. It gives an architecture like this, an architecture that is seamless. You can distinguish the new and the old, but the idea is not to emphasize this distinction. And this is the entrance, which looks, maybe it would be interesting to turn off the light for these pictures, but because there's indeed some detail in here. This is the entrance, which looks like an add-on of a machine onto the building. And this is the way the main hall is made. So this is the main theater, in which we invested in all the money that we could. We invested in making a theater with daylight. So this is double glazing, with a theater standing on 5 columns, with a space completely open to the scene. So really a kind of venue that doesn't talk about the cultural center as it was before in this area. So not not parochial, but really regional and really public as a dimension, and giving it qualities that you find in very few theater halls today, like daylight, which also allows it to use not just as a representation space, but also really as a production place where you can produce theater, where you can produce plays, or where you can have big conferences which are very attractive to attend. And so on top of this window you have the extended roofscape, which is like an elevated public domain looking onto the Teril. And although the area around it is very terrain vague still, making this combination of an elevated platform with a wonderful view somehow captivates the energy of this openness and the energy of this vagueness. And so, what do we think we have done with this proposal? With extending these tiles, with making too much space, with making space which is unprogrammed but available. But we think that this kind of interior space, which is available, allows the users of the building to gradually invent their program. So they're coming from a situation where their cultural center was actually in the center. They took the bold move to move it outside of the city center and put it in this old industrial building. So you know that they don't have the habits yet of inhabiting this new space. But still, there's enough clues in the building to start to learn how to use it and to develop a program, not based on a brief, but based on experience and based on testing out and experimenting. And this is indeed what they have done. They have, a lot of people have started to occupy the building in many different ways with these clues of how it can be used. It's a flexible space, but it's not a neutral space. And so the space gives many pockets, many areas that people can relate to, but also start to use. It's like a space that invites to be used. So here, for instance, I will give an example of this type of space, where here there's the design center, which has a door here and has a few spaces, but the use of this space easily spills out into the big space, and I think this has really proven the importance of giving people opportunities. So this was the first sketch or concept sketch of extending the inside to the outside and producing a new relation between a new facility and the old one that share a certain set of characteristics. This is the space how it was renovated. So you see it resembles quite a lot the way it was before. It's shot by a better photographer. The first picture was ours. It basically has still a few things which are not completely, so here you see, for instance, saving money by not completely replastering. You see new railings, you see old railings, but basically it's making a few openings, making a few connections, and that was it. And then this space is used as a space where different things are organized, where different crowds of people connect. So this is, for instance, part of an exhibition which was related to a set of workshops. Workshops where they made people from the design school across the street, also one of the new projects in this area, where they made them workshop together with entrepreneurs from the region, trying to find new business opportunities. And so this kind of informal setting somehow stimulates people to behave differently and to be more dynamic. This is an example of the design center. And this is also an example of one of the events that take place in this space. So you could say it's pretty ugly what they have done there, or it really clashes with the building. But I think the clash is interesting in the sense that the power of the space allows for other things to happen inside it, things that can be conflictuous, things that are not completely aligned, but still the legibility of the space and the size of the space allows for differences and for diversity to emerge. So here you see also the existing tiling. Here you see an opening of an event. So this space, although it was not up to standard, is used a lot of the times for very informal events, and this informality is very powerful. And the same kind of use happens in the spaces outside, where there's also connections, so also the balconies can be used. And this type of space, this is a picture we didn't take, but it's taken from the internet. The space has become a destination for people that just use it as a scenery, that use it as because they relate to it, because they feel it's part of their identity. So I think this is also a quality of a public building, that even use that is not known finds place there, and that people have enough clues to connect to it. So I think this is a very precious gift, that people relate the most important moments in their life to this building. Because what does it say about the history of Limburg, the history of Genk, this building? So as you see, this building is part of a very industrialized, very green region. This is a plan, for instance, of the city center and of the sea mine cluster, with all of this infrastructure in between, with garden cities, and with an existing environment which again for the second time has lost its motor. So after the closure of the mines, there was the closure of this Ford factory. So here you could say people from Genk support each other. So at a certain point in time, a few years ago, 5,000 people lost their jobs. So this is really a kind of global, powerful economy, and the agenda that the city has set itself, amongst others with Sea Mine, is to rethink this agenda and to rewire their region. And I want to show a project of, let's say, colleague architect. They're called new architects from Gent, not Genk, but from Ghent, and who made the tourist experience, which is basically using the ventilation shafts of the mines to build a tourist experience about mines. But what is very beautiful about the project that they did is that they developed it more as a kind of discovery parcours. So not as something that you just consume, but really as something that triggers you to discover it. It also is reusing the existing and redefining it. So it is the same, but it's also very different. And also they have developed a toolkit for children. So they get a belt and they get the right gear to discover this parcours that these architects made. And so the children are really triggered not to learn just about history, but to do two things at once, to learn about history, but also to be in a kind of investigative mode, to learn to be curious, to learn to discover. And so it's a very abstract exhibition, but if you visit it with children, it really comes to life. So it's really about this new mindset, and I think in that sense the project is very successful and shows that even small things can be very strategic and important for a region, to really treat every project with a vision. And I think these architects succeeded very successfully in making something that is very exciting. And so you really have a parcours on the mines which goes from the ground to the sky, and which offers a new vision on the quality of the regions, and it's a very interesting and very telling experience. And I think this idea of redefinition, of taking something that is old, using its identity, but completely transforming it, I think this is something very powerful to work with. And this is an example of how this area, Sea Mine, how it also makes people relate to it because of this redefinition. So this is, for instance, so the Tesla cars, the electrical cars, it's a kind of car happening in front of the cultural center. So you see that the area is still quite big. And then they say in their tweet, what a contrast, former coal mine versus the electric drive of today. And I think both are important to somehow look for something new, but that the new is not just footloose, but really relates also to something that has existed before. So this is also part of the idea of a public space today, I think, where the building is also just a backdrop for temporary events, for kind of placemaking, but placemaking in a very loose and a very open way. And in this placemaking, it's really also about trying to rethink the relation between an old factory that existed, but existing urban fabric, and to rethink connections on many levels, connections between entrepreneurs and designers, connection between the population and their history, and connections between new technology and old places that spring from different types of technology. And we wanted to elaborate this idea of finding new connections in another project, which is more located in the west of Belgium, around the border of France, which is known as the far west from Belgium, the far west of Belgium. It's a kind of very dynamic entrepreneurial landscape, and the project of Buddha Factory relates to it very strongly. And I just wanted to show with this map also a project with that AMO once did, which is a reading of what this area actually is, as both historically different types of cities that conglomerate and produced a certain set of culture, but today, let's let's say, an area which is maybe an area of subcultures, and this kind of subculture is even enhanced, I think, in the digital era of everyone having its own networks in their private phones. I think this is also a question of how can we invent things that deal with this question of subcultures, and how can we invent things that are open enough for different subcultures and different people to relate to without defining the identity of what we design.
Hi. So we just saw a building, a sea mine, which was a building where we defined, let's say, sharing or a space for many. So a building that allows a lot of people or groups to use it differently. And Buddha Fabrik, the next project I will show, goes a bit further in this, as it's not just a building, it's even more an environment, which we defined as an environment that triggers connections between all these subcultures that Freek just mentioned. So we tried to define it, or to create a space that allows to let all these subcultures somehow relate to. The building is in Kortrijk, in West Flanders. It's on an island between two arms of a river. You see it here. This is actually the building. It was a former textile factory, and while it has also an industrial history, like Seaman we just saw, where Seaman was a representation of the grandeur, of the elegance of technology of 100 years ago. This was a textile factory which didn't have any elegance at all. It was not even visible to the street. There was just a little entrance here. This is already another building. This was, I guess, another function. So you entered it here, and this was actually the factory. So there was no representational value at all in there. And the city asked us to develop a building mainly for artists and residents, so artist ateliers, because on this island there are already a group of, or a set of cultural functions. There's a dance school, there's cinemas, so they asked a space for art production that can accompany, that can be accompanied to these more representational spaces. But still, not just for production, but also that allows a certain public insight, and invites also people to experience production of art. What we actually did is that we hollowed out two pentagonal spaces. While the one isn't really a space inside the existing building, the other one is an added-on space in front of the building, which becomes the only face, almost like the tip of an iceberg of the whole building, that is visible to the public. In reality, the transformation looks like this: that before there was just a wall with a big door. It's hard to see, I guess. Now there's this yellow brick pentagon as a vestibule, as a Vorplatz, so to say, of the factory that's the face of the factory actually. And on the inside, well, this was a typical, very pragmatic factory building with concrete columns, concrete beams, a lot of brickwork infill. We opened up a space by taking out a lot of floor elements. So, and this pentagonal shape was actually already there in the structure of the building. It's not an invention, and the exterior space got its idea from this interior space. So what we see here is what we actually added on the ground floor. That's all the red parts. So most of the space actually is just based on the same construction that was there. It was just some toilets added. As I said, this space was hollowed out. There's a new circulation. And then there's the addition of this pentagonal space in front of the building next as an entrance situation of the building. So we basically defined two very specific spaces. The one on the outside, it's just two doors, some light, and these high walls and a view to the sky. The one on the inside, which has the stairs, but besides these is very empty. These very specific spaces, on the other hand, create on their external or on their outsides a lot of situation with a much finer grain. So there's, for example, the moment when you leave the vestibule and you enter the building. You go through this gap. You see the old and new clashing, but also making a harmonic atmosphere of old and new. And on the other hand side, on the outside, the strong light inside the space gives a clear indication of what is the entrance. On the other hand side, you have all these corners around where people can gather, where people can wait before or after an event. So that allows a lot of appropriation on all kinds of levels, very official, also very unofficial or casual. The building here, in this sense, is drawn as a part of all the interior spaces on this island. Well, here you have a river, and then it basically goes up there and comes back here. So this is the island. The blue functions are the existing and the new cultural functions. And as you can see, we couldn't define the building from its outside, so it doesn't have a representational facade, since it's simply inside this building block. The building gets its identity from these two cores, from these two spaces. That allows, on the other hand, that there's no boundary, that there's no parameter of this building. You can use it with just this as the circulation in the space here. You can use the whole building. You can there are even events in the city, like a Kortrijk Interior Expo, which is basically a furniture fair in the whole city. So where suddenly the whole building is used for this fair, but also spaces like this one. So the experience, let's say, starts from these central spaces, but is much bigger than just the building in itself. So just a plan to explain how it works. You basically enter here, you go through the space here, then to the inside. You have the ground floor, which is today used by a fab lab, so production 3D printer laser cut space. And you already have some exhibition spaces or multifunctional spaces, let's say. From here, you start up a tour. You come up with a stair here. You've got another space which links to a set of multifunctional spaces, some directly from this pentagon, some indirectly through a enfilade of spaces. And then you circle further up in other spaces, in other big exhibition areas, until you actually reach the roof terrace of the building, which so in section the same. You enter here, then you have this pentagonal space with a wooden stair that in the end leads up to the roof terrace. And the space in itself are very high, but very very open also, so you can use them for all kind of exhibition, workshops, events. And this central space, as I said, spirals up with a circulation. This is the Fab Lab, so from this central space you can access a lot of different functions, and when you're in the space you suddenly get a very easy, very natural overview of all things happening inside. Because wherever you are, you have an opposite where you see things happening. And in the end, you reach the roof terrace, where the building, while not or hardly present in the public space seen from the outside, suddenly gets a very, very distinctive relation to the city. Because from there, you simply the city is all around you. This building is hardly defined in terms of program. All these spaces are almost waiting for you to come to program them. And this drawing shows a bit all the different settings that are possible of these spaces. And it's also an intention to show them not in plan but separate, because all these spaces can either function together as one big exhibition, they can function as 12 different installations. And what's very important is the fact, by having this open building, this building also triggers relations between things happening. So you cannot just have one exhibition independent from the other, but because you somehow pass by or relate to it while accessing, you get relations and constellations between different things that are challenging, but also giving a lot of potential and chances of encounters and new experiences. So the interior spaces are very diverse. Some are open with a roof light. Some are very enclosed and dark with more artificial lighting. As you can see, we hardly put any money into new materials. This is really just clean. Some walls are filled up with new stones. Some are just clean, some are not even treated at all. But this open structure allows all kinds of happenings inside. So as I said, this was part of this furniture fair, the concerts on the roof. There's this Fab Lab production space on the ground floor. There are other kind of exhibitions. They even planted a forest inside. There are car presentations. This was part of the opening, where also the space in front of the building suddenly becomes part of the experience. Or they of course use it also for educational purposes. So all kinds of things actually happen in there, and the building is also, even in the sense that we delivered it, the building is never finished. This building, because maybe you see it best on this picture, because we hardly put a real finish on all these surfaces and structures, it still allows a lot of adaptations. For example, there was never a fixed place foreseen for a bar, and just out of the experience after 2 or 3 years, now that the building is in use, people realized that it's best suited, and they just put a new water pipe to this place, and suddenly this is a place of the bar. It's nothing that we defined, it's something that came out of experience by using the building. Or for example, they wanted to do this car event, but there was no door big enough to actually get a car inside. And by simply breaking out a big part of the wall, outside wall, using a huge forklift and bringing these cars from the outside in, it was possible even for very rather simple. And so because the building, you can hardly damage it because it's really open to adaptation. It's even so open that people continue thinking of changing this. And this was a workshop of the design students to transform the central space into a theater stage. And that's the nice thing about this building. Because it's so open, people aren't afraid to use their imagination to transform it in any way as they want. So we had it about connections here, connection of different functions and uses of this building. Here it was very concentrated, almost brought down to a single core, which facilitates this exchange in a point. The next project we will show deals more also with connection, but on a much bigger scale.
Yes, because we with this building and this space, so this space is in a way overscaled for the size of the building, but it allows for different types of collectivities, different types of public to come together in different moments in time. And I think this is something that we think is very interesting, that you don't, let's say, if you design a car, you design it for the moment that it crashes. So it's a lot of material, it's a lot of, so you somehow design it for the worst case scenario. In a space, it's often the same, that you define it for the type of use that is the most conflictuous. And we think there's a lot of leeway in opening this up, this kind of definition of how big or how small something can be. So here we designed a space that is too big for the building, but really on scale of the neighborhood. In Alzette in Luxembourg, or in France, close to Luxembourg, we did a reflection on the redefinition of this territory based on the same idea of a fluid parameter and of culture inhabiting spaces in different moments in time. This is just to give you an idea of the territory. This is Luxembourg, this is Thionville, Metz, and this is the area that we talk about. So this is a project of national interest. So France does every few years, they invest some money in some region, and they build a kind of administration that is getting a budget to reboot some of these areas. And so the area that you should imagine it as very similar to the area around Simon. With this specificity that they are very close to Luxembourg. And so this part of France is basically a sleeping city where a lot of people live because it's cheaper than to live in Luxembourg, and they commute every day to the center of Luxembourg. And so the question of this area is not only to build extra housing, but also to develop a cultural identity. And if you look at the existing public facilities or cultural facilities, a lot of the quality sits outside of this region. And so this is maybe more a reflection on how these fluid parameters could also work on a territorial scale, where there's indeed a kind of built mass in this area, half destroyed, half demolished, but also half still in use and half, let's say, attractive. For instance, there is very interesting walls which were part of the mines which still exist. And basically we proposed them a way how to use this infrastructure, not by building cultural center in some specific place, but more to build a program that would reuse space and would activate space differently in time. And why would this be interesting? First of all, it would one possibility would be to have a parcours, where parcours would be able to link spaces which are in themselves not maybe the most excellent, but together with the spatial experience of the landscape in between it, that would really reveal a very unique asset of this area, because it's very hilly and the mine infrastructure constructed a lot of viaducts and a lot of difference in height. And so here you see the edge of France and Luxembourg, so this would be a cross-border parcours, basically connecting programs in different time frames, but also to think about this cross-border situation. So this is a Luxembourg station, and this is a Luxembourg development, and here is actually the border of France. So you could use the emptiness of France to let's say, activate it in different moments in time, and to use this new and high-performance station to suddenly attract an audience in this area, which comes from a very different bassin, or I don't know how you call it in English, but like an action radius. So this kind of combinations of empty and full we think are very interesting. And the same goes for a new road which was installed. So this is a new connection road that was planned before we came, connecting the Luxembourg station to the development in France. And this is something that is really part of the commuting life of this area, where people drive into the Luxembourg work basin. And that this kind of activity, this kind of infrastructure facility connects to the station, so it could also work the other way around, that in the weekend maybe it becomes part of a very informal but very stretched, beautiful market, where suddenly this infrastructure which exists and which is designed for weekdays, that on Sundays you really create a different experience on it. And why I wanted to show this example in this lecture is also because I heard about the question of the mosque of 20,000 people, which makes you think of monuments in maybe the most obvious way very easily, of having a very big building that can host a big amount of people in some moments in time. But maybe these examples allow you to reflect on that differently and to maybe create a constellation of spaces, a constellation of interventions which can still host the same program but activate the urban area and the public area in a very different way. You only have to think of Mecca in relation to this space, and I think you can already get quite a different imagination of how a mosque could occupy an urban area. So we have talked until now about space and space that allows to share. And of course this is about building a kind of awareness and intelligence of what is the potential of these spaces. And a big question there is, do we as architects see the same potential and live the potential in the same way as the people that we built for? And I think there's a big knowledge gap there. For instance, and what we do alongside designing buildings and activating space is also trying to find tools to bridge this knowledge gap. And I think this is a very important, very interesting agenda for architects. And this is an example again of LZ, where we printed a map and we had a discussion. And basically everyone was saying how ugly their site is and how bad they are, in what kind of bad situation they're in, and how there's nothing happening, and so a very negative atmosphere. But in the same session we asked everyone to at least make one thing they like, that they appreciate about the area. And so some people made, for instance, the viaduct, other people made a piece of the forest that they knew. And so gradually everyone around was a session of 2 days. Everyone produced something. This was listed on a wall beside it. And gradually you know, collectively a new image of their territory was made, however hesitant and however fragile it is. But suddenly people started to read their territory differently and also started to communicate with each other about places that they knew or didn't know. And I think this kind of new perspective on the places that we know already is something very important. And I think this is part of the last chapter I would like to add to this lecture, is about ways of sharing and ways for us to learn continuously. A project which relates to that, in which we developed a tool called an urban reality drawing. It's Alvéole Saint-Nazaire. It's about this submarine base built by the Germans in France. A building impossible to destroy, which sits in between the city center and the port. And so the former mayor decided, since it was impossible to destroy, to make a public project out of it, asking a German architect to make an experimental music space, adding a tourist destination, rethinking the roof. And so it's for 25 years already this project has been redeveloped, from Sola Morales, a Spanish architect, doing interventions, until we came, adding in one of these parking garages for submarine boats a program which is called Popular Festivity Hall, adding some daily use to the space. So this is the atmosphere of the inside, and this is the project that we are doing, which is occupying with one big festivity hall with service spaces and with storage spaces. But we also understood that this project is of a very big strategic impact for the city, and we knew that if you would just develop the building as a building inside another building, that you lose a lot of potential. So, and we also knew that, for instance, this is the space next to the festivity hall, but it was also very important to give new life to these spaces by positioning the entrances in strategic spots. And so the tool that we developed for this, to through the project get to know all of the ambitions, all of the desires, all the failures of the city, we started to make a drawing on an urban scale. So here is the project. And by recropping, reframing this drawing, adding information to it, we gradually got to know what the city is really about. So this was the beginning of a kind of mapping potential exercise, where we reframed the drawing, so not to put the center in the center, but to put the basin in the center, to understand what spaces are activated, and then also to gradually map projects which are underway, to really understand how the project that we do could contribute to these other projects that are happening and could enter into a dialogue with it. And so this is, for instance, if you know that this space exists, the way how you treat even a facade inside the building can already indicate a kind of future connection that would happen later. And so these are very small things, but I think it's a part of the idea of building a building today is that you open up futures. I will not go into detail, but it's just to show you a type of tool that we use. This is a second one to somehow make scenarios of use and to make a model that is in a way so dumb and so childish that the client feels very feels very comfortable to play with it, to manipulate it, which is very different than making models which are very impressive. So to somehow make something which looks like a child's game, but in this child's game, it was much more easy for the client to enter into the mode of changing what we did, reproposing it, and shuffling it around. And I think this kind of creating this kind of liberty is very important, to the point that even the client starts to, let's say, the situation that the architect usually despises, but that the client starts to draw. We think it's a kind of interesting moment to enter, not to give up authority, but to build a kind of collaborative intelligence. So to have a pencil which designs in multiple ways. And I think another part, which is another thing that we also started to do more and more, is to really organize trips with clients and to take them to places that they don't know and to expand their set of references, which has the double advantage of getting to know them better, but also to open their minds and to start to see their own project in a different way. So this is really about building an experience. So the urban reality drawing as a way to start to map that, but building experience and building kind of knowledge through experiment and through use. We thought it was interesting to add one last project to it, which also talks about the idea of monument, but in a very different way.
And it's actually a project that is not a 5193 project, it's something that I'm working on with some other people. It's called Pool is Cool. It's based on the finding that while, for example, Berlin has 27 outdoor swimming pools, Brussels has exactly 0. This is a kind of question that in the summer comes up again and again. Where do you go out for swimming? So a very public happening that has no space in Brussels to happen. And we developed, or we still develop, a set of possibilities how to reinstall actually the possibility for a swimming pool. And one is, for example, looking at existing waters in the city. These could be ponds or rivers or canals, but on the other hand, maybe also the fountains in the city. And this is maybe the most impressive one in Brussels, a classic, I would say, old public monument, in the sense that it has a purely representational quality, but it's not really not accessible for people. You see these 4 lanes of cars driving around. There's absolutely no way to get there. That's at least legally. So now you could make a drawing and make collages to convince people how nice this idea would be and to transform this. So a bit what we did in Saint-Nazaire, develop a urban reality drawing, a kind of drawing that shows the future possibilities and potentials. Or you simply go there and you do it, you activate it instantly on the spot. And you just go swimming actually. So from the mapping experience, it's more like really experience. Mapping the potential is really like experiencing the potential, which gives the nice effect that the people that take part have immediately the urge to fight for this better future of the city of Brussels. But these pictures are also very imaginative, that you couldn't make a collage like this as convincing as a picture of the real happening. So this raises also, on the other scale, the question, there are the question that Freek mentioned in the beginning, there are a lot of old public monuments. Do we really need to build new ones? Isn't there a way to deal with existing ones? Can we transform them in order to accommodate new ways of sharing, of shared experiences in the city fabric that is there in space? Thanks. First we invite you for little discussions or questions.
So if people have questions, they can ask. Maybe to start up a little bit, I have some small questions. Maybe first to clarify a bit this title, New Public Monuments. New was not meant as new to be built. It was also possible to see it as a new interpretation of something existing. So it's not the focus on it has to be absolutely new. That's not surely the point. Maybe one question concerning the fact that on one hand you are in a Belgian office, and on the other hand the way how you work. You showed us for the bigger part projects in Belgium, a context which for me personally is known since several years now, which I mean slowly to understand, although I must say Belgium will never be understood by a foreigner, but I kind of mean to understand it. And I think Belgium has a lot to do with that, what you said in the beginning, rethinking things from the bottom, doing things from the bottom. Belgium is also a very democratic country, so everybody, or a lot of people have something to say in procedures, how to conceive buildings, how to make projects. Would you say that your strategy is, in that sense, a very Belgian strategy, first? And second, how do you use this Belgiumness? I would say it is very Belgian. Can you use it in the same way in other countries? Because you didn't show projects in Turkey or in Albania or I don't know. Can you work the same way, or do you have to adapt your way of working, or are you just especially successful because of this way of rethinking collectivity from the bottom, to work bottom up, to work this way, how you, I think, learned, especially in the Belgian context?
Maybe the first part of Belgiumness, I will have Paul answer that.
I didn't understand it at all until now. No, it's not true. I'm in Belgium for 7 years now, so I experienced quite a lot of it, and I think one of the reasons why I'm still there is exactly this openness and this strange freedom because of lack of one identity. Belgium is a country that has multiple identities, it has multiple languages, it has all kinds of administrational levels which, for example, don't exist in Germany. So you have to deal with a lot more constraints on the administrational part, but it leaves also a lot of freedom in conceptual thinking. because nothing is really defined in a way. So I don't know if this answers the
And if I then add on to that, for instance, it's true that, for instance, a country like France is much more procedural, and it's true that there's a challenge of if your design builds a certain understanding, builds a certain intelligence, will people go back to the initial brief, or will they adapt the initial brief? And I think that's the biggest conflict that we will have, is that if we develop something, we all understand that it's a better solution, but then are the decision makers willing to go back or to depart from what was defined at the beginning and really transform with us what they have done? And it's true that in contexts like Saint-Nazaire, where the constraints are so obvious, that it's easier to do that than, for instance, in housing projects where the brief is much more defined. So, for instance, we are doing a housing project in Lyon, where a part of the building, we managed to convince them to make apartments which are almost 3 meter height, because we find a kind of loophole in the regulations and in the setup of the project. And then everyone is convinced it's for the same budget, it fits every constraint, but then they start to look at the numbers, and then suddenly there's never written 3 meters, so then it becomes a problem. And there's actually no problem, but it's just a problem because of this kind of checklist attitude. And I think that's a problem that Europe in general has, that there's too much of a checklist attitude and not enough of a process attitude and a growing intelligence attitude.
For instance, in France, the procedures are set up in a way that they buy a design. So you make a competition, and they choose your competition project, and that's what they want. It's as if they go to a shop and buy a certain product. And as you said in our discussion before, you more like the way to really work with clients, to adapt the project slowly with the client together. But how does it help you then in countries like France? Do you have to really adapt your way of working, or do you still try to, in a sneaky way, introduce your way of thinking into the projects, or how does it influence your way to adapt to other cultures?
Well, I think you want to add something to that later? Yeah. It's clear that for a project like Saint-Nazaire, our ability to work with conflicts, to start from a conflict and not from a pre-cooked answer, was the reason why they chose us. Because we are dealing with these conflicts and gradually redefine these conflicts into opportunities. In Albania, it has proven successful, but it actually means that both we and them should have ownership, and just like we are able to repropose something, they should have the ownership of adapting. And I think this shared ownership, so you sit across each other as an engagement, and not just as service providers. And I feel a clear need for these processes to happen more. But there's still a huge conflict in some conditions that people, for instance, are not given the ownership to develop. For instance, if you work for a developer in France, the project manager will change every 3 months, so that the history of the project is erased and that they don't build too much, they are not too friendly with you, so that they can make sure that the numbers are correct at the end and people don't feel too attached to what they do. And obviously we look for situations where we work with people that do attach to what they do, because we think it's much more engaging to work like that.
I think in order to give or to make people attached to the project and to see it as a shared experience and a shared challenge to develop the project, I think one of the tools, I wouldn't call it a tool, but for example this trip of inviting the client to a project in Belgium, to not just to get to know them better, but also to give them the confidentiality or the reassurance that we are able to make this, and that a project as we propose can result in a very, very successful project. A process we propose can result in something impressive, and this reassures them, hopefully, to go further steps with us in a direction that they are maybe not used to.
And that's also how but it's maybe very technical for students, but I think it's something to think about. Normally you're paid a ratio per square meter, and we're also redefining contracts to just sell trips or to sell meetings, and to really, because the Buddha factory was built for 2 million euros, which is absolutely no money, and if you get a ratio on square meters you cannot do anything, because that's 500 euro per square meters. But together with the client we left some spaces untreated, some spaces don't have heating, so it's a very radical choice of making something that is offering potential, but just then giving up on things that you cannot do because you don't have enough budget. So it's a very different mentality, and we need to also find the tools and the organizations to allow this kind of way of working to happen.
Maybe a last question from my side, and then we can ask the public if there's more questions. We discussed before this issue of public clients, so it's all about public architecture. You also mentioned that it's more and more about subcultures. So one could question, for instance, is there still one public? Is it maybe several ones? What's your experience with the public client as such? Is he still existing? Our experience is that he's disappearing, that it's only anonymous administrative bodies which make a kind of administration around the project but have no vision. What is your experience with that? And how does that impact also your work, maybe?
Well, I think there's a true issue there. That it's especially if the projects become more territorial, bigger in scale, there's a real challenge of finding the right client. So you are indeed against someone and you don't know if he or she will also take the final decision. So I think that's a huge issue of checking your clients. And I know, for instance, that big offices have this kind of, they have accountants that can screen clients financially, and they can see if they are financially viable clients to work with. We don't step into things like this, but trips like this help to detect what the force field of this constellation of actors, how it works. And sometimes it's very surprising how it works. And it's a bit like if you have a public hearing, it's not often the person who speaks the loudest that takes the decision, but just the person just behind them. And so it's things like this that we should also train ourselves to read better. But indeed, the small cities like Saint-Nazaire, since they are smaller, they are much more personal. And in a way, surprisingly, it's much more fertile as a context than these big organizations. So in that sense, Belgium, the west of Germany, Holland, with all of these kind of small communities, maybe also has a potential of developing in the future more interesting projects than the huge capitals that we know.
Which is already the case since some decades, I would say. I would like to pass the microphone to the audience. Are there questions from the students or from other professors, teachers, whoever? No questions. Was it so boring?
No, not at all. Freek and Paul, you showed us a lot of more or less subtle and more or less informal projects. And what is your approach towards something like a civic grandeur? Because you oppose to the term monument so much, and I would like to know about, like, maybe it's like behind like a backstage comment on, like, when you're in the office and you make decisions. What are the reasons for opting into the informal direction, or what are the reasons to go for the flashiness of something straight, something grand?
A question I didn't dare to ask.
Well, I wouldn't say that our projects shy away from grandeur. For instance, the Buddha factory, the space, it's very impressive. So if you enter, you become silent. So I think these moments are important, but they are more treated as an experience. So spaces that generate that experience, then grandeur as... So I would say it's maybe an inviting grandeur, or a maybe slightly provocative grandeur, or slightly destabilizing. So for instance, if you enter the Buddha factory, and it's like a mental valve a bit. You really don't know why this space is there, but it sets the tone for the rest of the building. So by investing in this space, we changed everything without touching it. And I think this is maybe our approach to grandeur. For instance, this tile that continues outside in C mine. We only do this, but it changes everything. And so it's strategic interventions. And yeah, I think that's very important. Maybe indeed we stress the informality in the lecture too much. But this idea of allowing to be slightly misunderstood or not completely clear, to be ambiguous. I think this is a very important quality of these projects, and that's also why they work, I think, because it's not so clear why you need this. And that's maybe true that in Belgium we can pull this off, that we can make spaces like this. So I remember a discussion, for instance, on C mine, when we presented this image. This one. This one. We had it in a more rough version, and the client was asking, like, yeah, but your building, it doesn't have an icon. I mean, what is it? It's just boxes. And yeah, we argued that we stressed the experience of the space very much, but we also said, yeah, you already have your icons, so why would you invest again in something which is already there? Just make something that pulls your attention to the things that are impossible to recreate today. So it's, but I think we can be grand.
I have a question about, Andre Kemp asked you about public clients. I would like to know, there's another system in Belgium about competitions. I think a really good one, the Open Oproep. And Peter Swinnen, one of the founding partners of your office, is now the Rijksbouwmeester. Is it something you also initiated, this, or you influenced this kind of treatment with competitions in this way, like the Open Oproep works? Maybe you can explain how, because it differs quite a lot to other countries.
Well, there's two things. One is Vlaams Bouwmeester and Open Oproep, and it's true that this open call system made competitions in which the dialogue was fundamental. So you were not presenting on panels, but you were presenting ideas, you were delivering a presentation, and you could build an argument. And I think these projects we wouldn't be able to sell or to convince people that they're good if we couldn't build this argument. So this narrative part, to explain the reasons why you do things, is a very important part of this procedure. And they had to adapt their procedure to make it fit European legislation. And so in the beginning it was very open, but then they had to have a first part which was anonymous, and then just before the presentation they open up the envelopes and make a choice, and then they go into the presentation and they can really find their choice based on the... So they had to invent a lot of ways to go from a procedure to a process in this open call system. But actually the two projects which are the C Mine and Buddha Factory projects are not competitions in that system. but competitions in something which is called the Stedenbeleid city policy, which is a fund that the Flemish government has installed to invest money in urban areas. And so it's the mayors of that city or the technical departments of that city that come with a proposal of what they want to do, and then the Flemish government gives funds. And what happens with these processes is often that these local authorities don't have the capacity to make very good briefs, and so they get a project director from the Flemish government that helps them to build the brief. And so every competition that you get in this kind of procedure is always half defined. So you get more of a problem than you get a kind of well-defined answer. And No, we were not involved in the in the definition of the system. I'm 41 years old, so no, but it's true that the open call system was developed by Bob van Reet, who is an architect who is now 70 years old, I think, and he understood that designing is searching for solutions, and so he always says he has very good one-liners always. He says that architecture is taking the responsibility to search, and he installed this system, and it's true that we as a young office could enter competitions and train and experiment and exercise. So we had a lot of potential to exercise. So where the generation before us exercised through private projects, we were giving the possibility to exercise through public projects as well, making quite some failures, but also some which are not, and we were giving a lot of space in a way.
I just want to add something. What makes the Open Up Group very different to competitions in Germany, but for example also in Switzerland, is indeed that you don't present 5 A0 panels, and I guess that's why it's also maybe interesting for students in the way how to present projects. It's not the way that you present high definition drawings and panels which have to stand for themselves, but it's more that you produce a story and that you have the chance, the time to tell this story. So that's why I show this picture, even though this was not part of a Open Up Group competition. It's still a good representation of what kind of material you can use, because I guess seeing this on a panel, on an A0 panel, might be a bit frightening, this very quick collage. On the other hand, if you embed it in an interesting story that you tell, maybe like we now presented the projects, it has a lot more potential, and with just little means you can tell a lot, and I guess that makes it interesting, the Open Up Groups, because you can develop ideas and explain ideas, and you don't just have to rely on one drawing, one image. On the other hand, it makes it also difficult for us today to actually take part in competitions in Germany, since it's true. Well, part of it is that they're hardly paid. On the other hand, this way of representing projects in just a few images, it's not anymore the way that we try to convince or talk about projects.
We appreciated a lot your coming. Thank you, and hope we see each other for the next lecture.